Hello and welcome to Pandemic Live. I'm Binyamin Appelbaum. I write about economics for the editorial board of the New York Times. This discussion is co-organized by Annual Reviews and the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University as part of an initiative to spread scientific ideas and findings that shed light on the COVID-19 pandemic. Annual Reviews is a nonprofit publisher dedicated to synthesizing and integrating knowledge for the progress of science and the benefit of society. CASB is an incubator for human-centered knowledge aimed at designing a better future. I'm talking today with two political economists, Margaret Levi of Stanford and the director of CASB, and Sir Tim Besley of the London School of Economics. Both of them have spent much of their careers doing comparative work, looking at how similar or different governments are in their political systems and their economic policies. Margaret is also the co-editor of the Annual Review of Political Science, and Tim is an editorial committee member of the Annual Review of Economics. We're here today to discuss the actions of government in dealing with COVID-19, how well that's worked, what hasn't worked, what we can learn going forward. While we chat, you can send us your questions. You can write them up in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can leave it in the comments section under the YouTube video, or you can tweet them under the hashtag #ARPandemicLive, and we'll be monitoring all of it and picking up some of those questions to ask our panel a little bit later in this broadcast. And now we're going to dive in. And I thought we'd start with you, Tim. I'd like to ask you about the premise of today's event. Why is politics important? What is the role of government in responding to a pandemic? Why does it matter whether politicians are doing their jobs?
So thank you, Benjamin, and welcome to everybody joining us. I think this crisis, like many other crises, but it really throws into sharp relief the way that government matters in our lives. Many people look immediately to government to both deal with the direct and indirect consequences of an event like this, and so it's a case in which the capacity of government to respond effectively is under the microscope. And we need to think about the role of politics, not just as something that stops the things that we want to happen happening, but rather as an enabling mechanism, a way of getting us to a better place. And historically, these moments like this, crises, have also been very important in spurring forward innovations in government and creating new forms of government intervention, but also new ways of coping with issues.
Margaret, the same question for you. How should we think about the role of politics in this crisis?
Well, I think we're social scientists, so we make distinctions. And what Tim was talking about was largely about politics as government, which is a critical part of this story. I'm also interested in the politics of people mobilizing, voting, engaging as citizens, and how that then affects the capacity of government to act. So I think of it as hopefully a virtuous circle. Government is often the first mover, but if civil society members don't comply with, and to a large extent voluntarily comply with government demands and extractions, it undermines. If they comply, it increases the capacity of government. If they refuse to comply, it undermines the capacity of government and the capacity of government to act. So I think this crisis is revealing ways in which both things are happening. And I'm not just talking about partisanship. I'm talking about the ways in which people are responding to scientific authorities and the role that government plays in promoting the trustworthiness of that science or not, the ways in which government is revealing when its agencies are not able to do something, and then how people react to that, gives us an opportunity to really rethink those institutions and agencies and how we can make them better for the future.
So describe, if you would, we've obviously seen quite a range on both of those dimensions, in the way that governments have responded, in the way that polities have responded. Describe that range and perhaps begin to give us a sense of what has distinguished those different responses.
So it's tempting to cut this in a conventional way, which would be to look, for example, at whether autocratic governments or democratic governments are responding differently. But I think that's much too crude a cut on the issue, although it's tempting to look at things that way. there are many, many institutional features of government that are critical in the way governments respond. For example, the capacity to raise tax revenues and therefore to implement the kind of very extensive and ambitious support programs that governments are implementing around the world is critical. And some governments are well placed to do that. They have the capacity to borrow a lot of money in capital markets very quickly to support their citizens, others much less so. So these are reflections of past decisions, I think, that governments have made and past political decisions to build the kind of infrastructure that government needs to support their citizens. Equally, there's the capacity of government to deliver such things as healthcare, the capacity of governments to have legal structures that allow them to implement the kinds of necessary decisions to lock down parts of the economy to try and contain the pandemic. All of these things, I think, the way they're structured in different places make what government can do differently feasible. In some of the richer Western countries, we take it for granted that governments have those capacities, but on a more global scale, there's a huge amount of differentiation to the extent that governments are really able to implement those kind of immediate responses that have proved necessary to keep this pandemic under control.
But even in terms of the advanced industrial capitalist democracies, we see a huge amount of variation, which I think is worth exploring. Not just in terms of government capacities, in terms of revenue extraction and healthcare, but also in the ways in which civil society is organized and the way in which it reacts to government policies. So, for example, we see in Sweden a decision which has been costly in terms of lives, but less costly than in some other countries, to not impose as serious lockdowns because there's some confidence that the citizens will, in fact, voluntarily engage in safe practices. In other countries, there's been more concern, like Taiwan has also engaged in an incredible amount of voluntary behavior. In other countries that are democratic, we've seen much more serious efforts at lockdown and government impositions of requirements. Italy had to revert to that in order to contain the crisis. So this interaction between civil society and government is really important. And affects when governments can actually build those kinds of institutions. The fact that Sweden has a good healthcare system, that Taiwan was able to respond, makes a big difference in the decisions of citizens whether or not to voluntarily comply.
Margaret, are there other factors that influence that as well, the degree to which citizens respond to the directives of government or do the things that need to be done without being directed?
There's a huge variation, and some of those are very obvious reasons for variation. Age is a factor. Obviously, those of us who are older are much more, and given the way in which the crisis was presented to us, are much more likely to stay at home and try to be safe than some of the younger generation, which believe that it won't affect them as badly, if at all. There's a huge variation in gender. It turns out females are more compliant according to the evidence that's been collected so far. And I should speak to that evidence for a second. Let me just digress for 1 second. The kind of evidence that's being collected on compliance with physical distancing and mask wearing, et cetera, is based either on surveys or on geodata collected from cell phones, how mobile people are, whether they're staying close to home or not. And all of that data is only 2 or 3 months old. So, we only have a very short window in which we're seeing this behavior. But females tend to be more compliant than males with the safety precautions. There's huge variation in most countries, not all countries, but most countries, having to do with socio-demographic variables. So if you're poor, if you rely on work that's still available, if you're a healthcare worker, you obviously are more likely to leave your home. If you're in very crowded conditions, you're more likely to have problems maintaining the health standards.
Tim, to what extent do we measure the success of a government's response by how carefully they're listening to the scientists? Is that what it means to be a good political leader?
Well, I mean, this has been very interesting the way it's played out over the world. Even in very advanced democracies like the US, we've had moments when apparently, let's say, the political leadership has gone off-road in the way it's portrayed some of the scientific lessons, not least
Nice way to put that, Tim.
Yes, I tried to put it as diplomatically as I possibly could, but I think it's very interesting how in a period which I would say in certain countries there'd been a decline in respect for science and experts in guiding government. I think this has come back with a vengeance. Now, Margaret mentioned Sweden. What's interesting about Sweden is how much independence there's been in the public health system to make policy decisions more or less outside of politics. There's a lot of real power, not just advisory power in the hands of scientists. Most other countries have advisory groups, and they have been enormously powerful. And I think we're just beginning to see a bit of a tension now, though, between what you might say is the perspective of public health and epidemiology with the perspective of economics. I mean, there's huge economic costs, and I think the question of how you achieve the balance between the economic costs of locking down and the public health benefits of locking down, you can't leave that entirely to science. At the end of the day, we have politicians who are put there to try and reconcile these very difficult trade-offs that we're seeing unfolding. I personally don't think there's such a thing as the right answer to those trade-offs. That's why politics is so important. It has to be done transparently. The best evidence has to come in, but ultimately it's the politicians that will make those decisions.
I couldn't agree more. But I do have to say that when there is a lack of belief in the trustworthiness of science by political leaders and by citizens, it makes it very much harder to make those trade-offs in a promising way. So you need to have some real understanding of the science, as well as as much understanding as we can, given the uncertainties of both the science and the economics, to figure out what the right practices might be, and within the context of a particular place and group of people who have very different kinds of needs and demands on the system.
But Margaret, I'm struck by describing are systemic factors that seem to predate the crisis. Are societies just stuck with the world in which they lived, or to what extent can they act within the context of the crisis to improve outcomes?
Well, again, the crisis has been very short so far. Hopefully, it won't go on forever. So we are a bit stuck at the moment with what we've inherited. We always are stuck to some extent with what we've inherited. So this is really beginning to be the moments when we can change some of those systemic givens, some of those leadership givens. I mean, there's lots of discussion in many countries around the world about what the appropriate kind of leadership is, whether at a local level, medium level state or region or whatever, or at the national level.
I think that's really important, because one thing we're seeing, and I think it's particularly true in Europe because of the fact that we look across the English Channel from where I sit, but people look at each other's governments in Europe and think about, is there a best practice out there? Something that defines a better response system, and then what are the factors that bring that about? I mean, but broadly, we're talking about a set of countries that have democratic institutions one way or another, have free media one way or another, and yet people look at Germany and say, well, the death rate per million in Germany is way lower than in France, right next door. So is that something that's driven by some kind of institutional features, some kind of setting, the way in which scientific advice is fed into the process? Is it a cultural factor? Do people behave differently? Even I've heard claims like people wash their hands more, wear face masks more. There's a whole series of issues here to unpack. And I think there's this phenomenon that I've been interested in for a long time. Actually, I got interested in studying differences across the United States of yardstick competition, as we call it, where policymakers are in competition with each other, looking at each other's response as a kind of barometer. The media will offer some salience to some of those differences. And then the citizens are trying to figure out, well, should we be more like Sweden? Should we be more like Germany? But there's a real set of interesting issues. And I think that will shape in the next few months the way in which we may then look to reforms that we need to have based on thinking of where is the best practice out there.
I want to just interject a reminder that we are gathering up questions for a bit later in the broadcast. You can submit them on Zoom, on YouTube, or by tweeting at the hashtag ARPandemicLive. Tim, elaborate on that. You're an expert. What are some of the lessons? What are some of the early conclusions we should be drawing about which approaches work, which systems, which structures? What are the takeaways?
Well, I mean, I think I don't have a whole lot yet. I mean, as Margaret keeps reminding us, this is very new that I would regard as definitive. But let me make a few conjectures in the interest of maybe even provoking more questions. But you know, the speed at which lockdowns occurred in different countries and the form of those lockdowns. I mean, we use this term already, which has come into the lexicon comparatively recently in a much too uniform way. You know, we would say, well, Italy has had a lockdown, France, Britain, Germany, US have all had versions of this. But when you drill down, you'll see there are very different components to this in terms of what citizens are asked to do and what they can and they cannot do. And I think one of the questions, one of the issues that I think has emerged quite quickly is the possibility that some countries were very slow to respond. But that's where I would come back to the role of politics again, because if our Prime Minister on February the 1st had come out with a recommendation to lock down the economy the way we did on March 23rd and said, look, I've got foresight here. We're going to enter a period in which ultimately we're going to have 30,000 plus deaths in the country. I just don't think the politics would have allowed that. It would not have seemed credible. It would have seemed, while it would now seem ahead of the curve, it would have looked really draconian and unnecessary. So I think one of the things we're learning is the politics really does shape the speed of this. But I think it's fair to say some countries will ultimately be thought of as being very slow to act. The other area where there's good, sorry, go ahead, Margaret.
Let me add a few things to that, because I think there are some things we're learning already that are going to have consequences for the future. One, we're learning that different kinds of leadership can matter. I'm thinking of the New Yorker article I recently read comparing King County, which is where I live in Seattle, to New York. And how they responded, and how there were really conscious decisions by the public health officials and Dow Constantine, who's the King County commissioner, the executive, about how to get people to be alert to the health hazards before there was really strong evidence of a health hazard, before people were really dying in droves. And in other places, they didn't do that. They didn't do that kind of thinking. So leadership can actually matter. We've learned, because of the revelation of how poor some of our public health systems are across the world, as well as our social insurance systems, that there are real corrections that are going to be needed going into the future, because we have now the knowledge that these pandemics could happen again. So that's the kind of opportunity that the Great Depression created, and I think those opportunities are there to think about. There are also some trade-offs we're beginning to see that we didn't think about so carefully before. Our notions of privacy are beginning to change, I think. I suspect we'll need more evidence on that. In a sense, we had a very, very precious, if you will, liberal idea of what privacy constituted, meant, and now, you know, having some kind of way of tracing this illness and certain kinds of interventions into our private data might be acceptable. It will depend who owns that data, how it's protected. All those issues are still there, but they're very different kinds of trade-offs being considered. It's not just the economy and health. It's also what we think are the right values to be promoted and how they will be best promoted through different kinds of institutional arrangements, provisions of social services, protection of privacy, what the technology companies should be allowed and not allowed to do, et cetera, et cetera.
Margaret, you've talked about the importance of differences in leadership and about the ability of leaders to get their people to follow them. We have several questions from the audience asking about places in which the leaders are failing and the ability of the public to get the leaders to listen to scientists, to improve the quality of the response. What about transmission in the opposite direction?
Yeah, I think we're seeing there's some evidence, and again, it's so early, Binyamin, that it's really hard to know how this all plays out politically and in terms of citizen attitudes and responses. But we're certainly seeing a huge variation. Take the United States, for example. We have 50 states, and we are seeing very different responses among governors. And there's beginning to be some very good research done on that, including by one of our fellows at CASBIS, Guy Grossman, looking at the variation in the way governors respond and then how that interacts with what citizens are willing to do. So what we need is more, this is supported by Annual Review and the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences. So, one of the things we really need here to answer that question is harder evidence. What we're dealing with right now is lots of anecdotes. We can see lots of presidents and heads of state and governors who are acting, in my view or Tim's view or your view, problematically, and others acting well. But it will take a while to sort out what really makes a difference there. So I keep going back to history, where we can look at somebody like FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president of the United States during the Great Depression, or some of the things that Angela Merkel did in order to try to help Europe, where there are various strategies that leaders use in order to make things work differently in the future than they have in the past. And there's really good evidence that that's possible when there's a huge crisis, when people are very uncertain. There are a lot of experiments, and then some take and some don't, but they require an administrative capacity being built underneath them. It can't just be a policy put in place. There's a whole social and political infrastructure that has to be designed. So it's not just leadership as rhetoric, it's also leadership with a capacity to start doing the kinds of things that Tim started this conversation with.
And I think it's really important that we understand now that we've got to be planning for the next phase of this, and we've got to get our politicians being forward-looking. I mean, in the middle of a crisis, naturally people are dealing with the immediate issue around the death toll, supporting people who are losing their jobs. But I think the contrast between the kind of forward-thinking that was done after the Second World War compared to what happened after the First World War is really instructive. We came out of the Second World War and started to build new institutions, thinking of new ways to deliver services. There was a kind of new, broadly social democratic model that was passed around the world to realize that we could really build states that could support their citizens and deal with many of the things that had gone wrong, both in the period of the Great Depression, but even in the sort of rather grisly aftermath of the First World War, where I don't think people really understood the kinds of fractures in society that are being created and needed to be repaired. So I do think now we've got to start getting that forward-looking component going and making sure that our political leaders are realizing that there is going to be an important set of issues to confront after the crisis is over.
Tim, we have a question about structures for decision-making. The questioner asks in particular about cost-benefit analysis and its role in framing some of these conversations going forward. Are there structures, in your view, that politicians can or should use that produce better outcomes as they weigh these decisions?
The answer is clearly yes, but I think it's dangerous to think we can sort of read the answer off a very precisely constructed cost-benefit test, particularly when one of the things that we're dealing with are human lives. Now, there are methods that my colleagues who do cost-benefit analysis use to try and value human life in a cost-benefit calculation, and they can be important and instructive. But I think the idea that this just comes down to some quantifiable scientific trade-off is dangerous. So one thing we've known, for example, for a very long time when we look at societies is they put very different amounts of investment into saving different kinds of lives. So airline safety is at one end of the spectrum. If there's an airline accident, there's huge responses, there's money spent to try and combat that. Whereas other forms of mortality get much less attention. Now, we could say that's because the world is not governed by cost-benefit analysis, or it could be because human psychology tells us that people have very different preferences about the kinds of ways in which we organize society and the people who gain and benefit. And that's where politics comes back again. It's the political process that tries to express the more emotional responses to these things, which the pure cost-benefit analysis just tries to put right outside the picture.
You've both emphasized that these are early days. It's an experiment in progress, as it were. I know it's interesting for me, and perhaps for some of the less expert members of our audience as well, to hear you talk both about how we're going to arrive at those conclusions. What is the process of judging this? To what extent, how do we know that politics mattered in the outcomes in different countries? How will you draw those conclusions?
That's part of our job to do that, and part of your job, Binyamin, obviously, at the New York Times, to try to figure out the role that politics plays in this. And we can do that with some methods that are easily at hand. I mean, we've already started doing the research using surveys, using behaviors, using information about who's protesting, what's the sources of the protest for opening the government, at efforts at unionization and expressions of workers' voice that weren't existing before. Those are all the kinds of politics that can make a difference, and we can track them and see how they translate into things like vote and lobbying and pressure. That's both partisan politics and other kinds of politics. I think there's another place that we haven't mentioned where the role of politics, at least as expressions of people to government, is another place where we can observe, which is in the media, both in the print media, like what you represent, but also in the social media, where there's a lot of tracking going on of the kinds of what issues are being amplified, what kinds of questions people are raising, how that changes with time, how the perceptions of the circumstances change with time. And all of that can be actually measured at some point and translated into what impact it has. So that's a very social science answer to that question. But right now we can just observe, and it's not a simple anecdotal observation. We can see that there is conflict going on, certainly in the US, but all over the world, as governments impose policies that people either like or don't like. And they're speaking out about that, and with different effects given who's in power at the moment, and who would like to be in power in the future moment.
And I think it's important to realize that a lot of what we do is in a way supportive of politics. So measurement is absolutely critical at this time, establishing who are the people really losing out from this crisis. So I think people have come to realize that some of the lockdowns have had a particular effect on women, who are often the carers and therefore are finding the strain of having to work from home much greater than for men who in traditional division of gender division of labor tend to be much less affected. So that's an example where we need measurement. I mean, that's a conjecture. I think it has some validity, but we need to go out. And this morning, funny enough, I was in a meeting with the head of our Office for National Statistics. And one way of supporting politics is to have better analysis and better data so that the political debates we have are better informed and that we can really get to the nub of what's going on in the world. And then, we may take different views about what we think is important, but it's good if we begin from a point where we're well informed about what's actually happened and who's lost out in which way.
There is inevitably a lot of interest among our audience in the consequences of all of this. One recurring question concerns nationalism, whether this is likely to strengthen the role of nations or to weaken the role of nations. And I'm curious for both of your thoughts about the likely implications.
Well, as with all such things, it can go either direction. I go back to history and the period of the Great Depression. And if you looked at capitalist democracies or pseudo-democracies across the world, we saw some respond with fascism and some respond with social democracy, some with nationalism that took a very virulent form, and some with nationalism that was translated into protection of their own countries and the rest of the world. If we think of, one of the things that we are seeing that worries me, it could be good, it could be bad, is that the nature of supply chains are changing. People are very worried about the supply of not only protective personal equipment, but food and many other goods. And so we're moving back to what in the 60s we called import substitution, a lot of countries trying to figure out how to make everything themselves. We were in a period prior to this pandemic of increasing anti-globalization, at least in the ways in which it was producing inequities around the world. But that doesn't mean that we aren't reliant on each other for certain natural resources, goods, trades, people, ideas, and it would be a shame to lose that in this process. The other side of that is the interest in health is leading us to recognize that we need to be doing much more sharing internationally of information, of equipment, of prescriptions, of all kinds of things. So that's not a totally satisfactory answer, because I really think we're at that moment where it could go either way, and it will go different ways in different countries given leadership and civil societies.
But I think we need one important thing we need to remind ourselves is that having strong nation states and nationalism are not the one and the same thing.
Correct.
What this has done is to remind us of the centrality still in a globalized world of living in nation states and the responses that they make. But the question of whether that provokes nationalism is not altogether clear. If you look at there's a lot of debate, and I guess that's part of the subtext of this question about the rise of certain kinds of right-wing populist nationalist leaders in various parts of the world. I think there's a decent chance that this will arrest the development of that, because there have been is a kind of displacement of what I would call traditional politics, traditional social democratic politics, emphasizing that we're trying to build cohesive societies around broad-based programs. And partly the fractures of globalization, I think, had led to a fragmentation of that traditional coalition. And that gave a kind of entree to certain kind of nationalist politics, the kind maybe many of us dislike more. And I think there's a chance that to rebuild a certain kind of nation state-based provisioning for citizens, which was the kind of model we tried to build. Now, that doesn't mean we should give up on international cooperation, far from it. There are many areas, and Margaret rightly highlighted them. But international cooperation works best, I think, when nation states are working well. There are people who kind of think the nation state is past its sell-by date and will eventually wither away. But I've got to say, given the achievements that many of the countries around the world have made on behalf of their citizens by having well-functioning nation states, I think there's a chance to reassert what that can do for citizens if it's well managed.
I want to add one thing to that, because one of the things that we're seeing is really interesting new alliances taking place within countries and across countries. I was just reading, so we're talking about nationalist leaders like Bolsonaro in Brazil. The gangs in the barrios in Brazil have begun to organize to get people to wear face masks, to create social distance, and working with the health authorities in some of those places to do it. You wouldn't have expected that alliance. But what's been generated is what I've called elsewhere an expanded community of fate, not faith, fate, people feeling that their destinies are entwined with each other. And it is in some places creating alliances which give us hope that those alliances could be sustained and will actually lead to thinking hard about improving the ways in which services are delivered to us and the kinds of politics we have.
I'm curious, the last crisis we had in 2008 really seemed to underscore the ways in which we were all interconnected financially in particular, and forced a lot of governments to cooperate in ways that they hadn't been willing to do previously. This feels quite different to me, at least. It feels like nations are seeing their interest in, as you've talked about, making their own medical supplies, looking out for their own citizens. Does it take us in a different direction as a consequence?
Well, here that trade-off, what wasn't true as in the Great Recession was the trade-off between health and the economy. And so I do think that puts another tension into this story. But the economy is beginning to be as dominant an issue as health. And both of those ultimately require coalitions, and coalitions that cross groups of people who didn't realize that their interests were similar, as well as countries that weren't cooperating before. So yes, it does feel different, and it is very different. But I think some of the responses will ultimately be the same in terms of, at least that's my aspiration, that will lead to more cooperation.
Yeah, and I share your sense, Binyamin, that we thought, some of us thought, in the midst of the 2008 onward crisis, that the world would emerge differently, and it didn't happen. So, and I think largely because it became very much a focus on some of the technocratic issues of re-engineering the financial system to limit the kind of spillovers that we saw that caused that crisis. So it became, instead of thinking about the social system as a whole or the economic system as a whole, there seemed to be a technological fix. And we built stronger institutions. We redesigned the responsibilities of financial regulators, both on a national and global scale, that seemed to fix the problem. The problem was not perceived to be a problem about the way societies functioned. It was just a problem of, oh, well, we just didn't have the right technocratic structure in place. Well, we may say the same in the end. I mean, in the end, if we fix the public health system so that we can get personal protective equipment, we can vaccinate, we can do all those things routinely in a way that we're struggling to do, maybe we'll all conclude that there's a technological fix to this crisis. But I do feel, because of the ways it's really permeating across society, and the people who are feeling the sense of huge anxiety that the life as they've lived it for the last 20 years is under threat, because we may not get a vaccination. I mean, everyone says, well, it'll be fine until we get a vaccine, but there's a very real chance in 18 months we'll have no vaccine at all. Then this may mean we have to make really fundamental changes in our lives in response to this in a way that was never necessary in the case of the financial.
Well, and it's not just the health changes, it's the disruptions in the economy. People have been losing jobs, businesses have been going under. Some of those jobs will come back, new businesses will be developed, but it is going to be a real fundamental change in the way people have lived their lives, and what kinds of work is available to them, and whether the skill sets match the work that is available. And again, as you pointed out earlier, Tim, different groups of people are suffering from this disproportionately. Here we are sitting in our relatively nice houses, able to, all of us continuing to be paid, but there are lots of people out in the world who are really suffering right now, without income, without food. And that's not going to change immediately. As soon as the health system is fixed and the health delivery is fixed, we're still going to have a big economic management problem.
But Tim, you put your finger on something interesting, which is the question of whether it does end up having an impact. You're right. 2008 felt so momentous at the time. People regarded it as a potentially world-changing event, and then nothing changed. So how likely is it that if we were to come back on Zoom 5 years from now, we would still be speaking of this as a consequential event? Consequential in the sense of changing structures, changing these types of things.
I'm going to wager it is a more decisive moment, in part because I just don't see, I think Margaret put her finger on it just now, that we don't have easy fixes for the many frailties in our societies and politics that this has revealed. They're not things that things that could take a while to work through. I mean, for example, the fact that many people don't have access because they have temporary employment to easy ways of tying them over in a crisis like this is, I think, really telling us our social insurance system in some way is not functioning in the way we hoped it would. So I do think these are not small fixes. These will ultimately be things that lead us to question the nature of our economies and societies. But I guess we'll have to reconvene in 5 years to find out whether we agree on that.
I'm curious about the way you think of the role of academics as in politics, and what I mean specifically is that, let's say you do reach conclusions about how the world should change, or which approaches worked better, which ways of governing worked better. How do you think about your role in conveying those lessons?
Well, both Tim and I are academics who are engaged with the public sphere, and or certainly hope that our work and the work of others is translated in ways that policymakers can hear and can use. And I think, I am optimistic that what we've learned and what we'll learn can in fact be useful. So that's one level at which I think academics can be incredibly important. We won't necessarily have the answers, but we certainly can have information that will inform the answers. The second way in which I think we can be very helpful is even more aspirational than that. As you know, Binyamin, and Tim knows, one of the things we've been doing at CASBES is trying to generate ideas for a new political economic framework. And that requires really thinking hard about not just statistics and information and observations, but also real ideas about how we organize ourselves. What are the groundings for that? What are the values we're going to emphasize? What kinds of who are we trying to serve? And what kinds of institutions could we build, and agencies and practices could we develop that will best serve those populations? Academics aren't alone in doing that, but that is an important role that, given the kind of ways in which we think, the kinds of access we have to the history of ideas, the history of failed and successful experiments, to the statistics and observations that are out there, we have a particular role to play and a particular obligation, I believe, in helping to design that new political economic framework. We call it a moral political economic framework because it has to have values in it as well.
Yeah, and I think that more widely speaks to the role of academia as a part of civil society. We tend to think it's part of an education system, but if you look at what's gone on in countries with strong academic systems, is many academics are already stepping up to the plate to try and, whether they be scientists or working on finding a vaccine, or social scientists looking at how you implement systems of social protection. All of these things, we've found it very useful to have academics on hand and with the motivation and willingness to play that role. And I think it's part of what's important in investing in a strong academic system in any country, that we can draw on those resources. I mean, if you go back, I'm not sure the analogy is perfect, but if you go back to the Second World War, one of the famous examples in British history was Bletchley Park. Bletchley Park was the place where they cracked the German codes to now allow a certain level of intelligence. Well, who was put in there? Well, one of the, it was people like Alan Turing and others. They were the academics who were sent off to fight to at least engage with the challenges of the day. Now, on a mini scale, I don't think it's quite on the same scale as what I'm referring to there. We're seeing groups of academics getting together to try and think through the problems. I'm currently involved in writing a report on testing, tracing, and isolation as how we implement such a system. And you get a bunch of academics together to try and work together. It cuts across disciplines. It can't just be someone with a science training or someone with an economics training. It's combining those disciplines. So I think we're seeing a huge role when it's deployed effectively. And of course, we can't be guaranteed that at the end of the day, the policymakers and politicians will listen. But I think there is a thirst for intelligence from carefully thought through solutions by academics at the moment.
And let's just be clear, it's not, I don't think either of us arguing that the academics should have the final say. These really are political decisions, but we need to play an important role in informing those decisions, and more of us are stepping up to the plate to do that.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Final thoughts from either of you, things you want the audience to take away from this discussion? I'll
leave the last word to Margaret, but I think there's the view of politics we need to dispense with. Politics is absolutely needed. It's, people get very irritated. They look at a politician misbehaving in ways that they don't approve of. But nothing really gets done at the end of the day unless the politicians lead us there. We can give them any amount of advice and encouragement, but we really need to fashion the politics that we deserve to solve the problems, and therefore we should think of politics as the solution, not the problem.
It's hard to add to that. I think politics is an essential part of the solution, and that politics involves not just leadership, but also, the people who serve the leadership. How leadership's competence is judged not just by who's the person making the speeches, but also how effectively he or she builds an organization and an infrastructure that enables to deliver to the citizens what they are demanding and need. And that is also an important part of politics, is mobilizing voices so that they can be heard effectively. And that somewhat depends on leadership, but it also depends on us. And and us meaning me as a citizen, not me as an academic. And so I'm very hopeful that this moment, which is stimulating a lot of people to be aware of how relevant politics is, which is not the case usually, will actually stimulate a lot of citizens to think about what kind of politics they really want and help put that into place.
Well, I hope that's true. Thank you, Margaret and Tim. Thank you all for joining us today. This was the second episode of Pandemic Live. You can find it and all episodes in the series at annualreviews.org, and we'll include a link on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
They turn off the light.